Open the podcast bay doors, Hal.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 185 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits, but I've found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here, you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. We're closing in on the end of August, so it's time for another patron shout-out. My sincere thanks go out to the following: Mike Sterling, Justin Bailey, Lily and Sam Breen, Jesse Clark, Ricky Garvin, Rob Garrison, Aaron Woodward, Aaron Borst, Carla Hoffman, Julio Herrera, and Matthew Saint. And if you want to join in with helping the show out, it's just $1 per month, and that gets you this monthly shoutout, as well as audio outtakes and full scripts of every written show. Once again, we're continuing on with the lesser-known X-Men, and we've got a few characters whose tenures in the team were fairly short, starting with Stacy X. Born Miranda Lavalde, we first meet the character in Uncanny X-Men number 399, written by Joe Casey with art by Tom Rainey. In that issue, Archangel, along with Iceman and Nightcrawler, are investigating a location in Nevada called the X Ranch. It turns out to be a brothel with various mutants whose powers allow them to do superpowered sex work. Miranda, going by Stacy, is one of the sex workers there, and is the only survivor when the ranch is attacked by the Church of Humanity, as they teleported in and killed the others before any of the X-Men could react. Archangel takes Stacy in, and she is officially a member of the team the very next issue, although at first she's told to only observe. In addition to being a decent hand-to-hand fighter and being covered in snake-like scales that offer some degree of physical protection, Stacy has complete control over her pheromones, and through skin-to-skin contact is able to stimulate physiological reactions in others. It's obvious where this would be useful in sex work, but in combat she's also able to use this to make people throw up or otherwise become incapacitated. And she can also use it to wake people up who have been knocked out by pumping them with adrenaline. We eventually learn a little of her backstory, that she grew up as a fairly popular kid in school until her mutant appearance manifested, with her learning of her powers shortly thereafter. Being rejected by her family and possessing few skills for other kinds of employment, she was recruited to the X Ranch by its owner, Madame Drake. In publishing terms, Stacy spent about 2 years on the team, but left when she realized that Archangel preferred young Paige Guthrie, who we'll get to in a later episode, to herself. Stacy was one of the many mutants to lose her powers, and in her case, her more inhuman appearance, at the conclusion of House of M. She returned to sex work briefly, though without her powers could no longer hold back on the kinds of activities she took place in, and was recruited into Bandit/Night Thrasher's team of New Warriors, as I mentioned briefly in episode 175. Using a collection of technology, mostly from villains, Slide, Frogman, and Whiplash among others, Stacy chose the name Ripcord. She was one of the 2 killed in New Warriors Volume 4, number 16, but later showed up alive again, now using makeup to appear like her mutant self. During the Krakoan era, she showed back up, now repowered, but stuck to the outer reaches of the mutant society in a section called the Bower, with others who didn't feel like they fit in. She also ran a daycare on the island for abandoned mutant babies. Even among X-Men fans, she is not one of the more popular characters, so it's no surprise that she hasn't been seen post-Hellfire Gala massacre. But with no corpse shown on panel, it's likely she'll show up again at some point down the line. Next up are the brother and sister team of Heather and Davis, or Davy, Cameron, also known as Lifeguard and Slipstream. The pair lived in Australia as a lifeguard and a surfer, respectively. We first meet them in Extreme X-Men issue 6, created by Chris Claremont and Salvador Larroca, when Storm and Thunderbird, who you learned about a few episodes back, came to investigate them, as Gambit had been framed for the murder of their biological father, who was an Australian crime lord who called himself Viceroy. Having not been raised by him, the pair had no idea of this connection, but because others were aware, they found themselves as pawns in a gang war. They quickly joined up with Storm's team of X-Men, and Davis had a brief relationship with the team leader, while Heather had a longer relationship with Thunderbird. At first, Heather was the only one of the two to have powers, with the ability to adapt her body to whatever necessary to save herself or others around her. This usually manifested in golden armor, sometimes with wings, but could include any number of temporary changes, including super strength, gills for breathing underwater, and even additional arms for carrying people out of danger. Davy, on the other hand, eventually got his mutant gene activated by Sage, and learned to create a warp wave that could transport himself and his companions anywhere on Earth he wanted, although taking others with him tired him out. He was also sensitive to the energy signatures of other teleportation effects, allowing him to track them down to their destination. Unfortunately, in one of his first fights alongside the X-Men, Slipstream was massively injured. While he was recovering, his sister was learning more about their origins. It turns out their mother was actually a member of the Shi'ar royal family, and that alien DNA started manifesting itself in other changes in her body. By the time he woke up, Davy no longer recognized Heather as his sister, and decided to leave the team, asking Heather not to try to find him. She and Thunderbird did attempt to locate him, but were unsuccessful and returned to the X-Men franchise, joining the X Corporation. Though after the House of M, the company's doors were quickly closed. Lifeguard was one of the few whose powers remained after the "No More Mutants" declaration, but Slipstream was not so lucky. While she wasn't seen actively in any titles for a while, the informational book called the 198 Files told us that she was still living at the Xavier Institute for a time. She was also briefly seen on Cyclops' team after he split off from the X-Men during the Schism storyline, and also cameoed occasionally in the background panels of various X-Men titles during the Krakoan era. Slipstream also appeared at least once at this time, but we haven't had any stories showing the brother and sister together, so until we get a story that tells us otherwise, I have to assume that they are still not on speaking terms. As is common for less well-known X-Men characters, we don't have any confirmation of their status post-Hellfire Gala, but as you've seen, pretty much everyone comes back eventually, so I'm sure the Cameron siblings will show up sometime down the line. Finally, we have a character I discussed a little bit not that long ago, when I invited Jenny the Geek on to discuss LGBTQ characters in Marvel Comics. The first Marvel superhero to ever come out of the closet was Jean-Paul Beaubier, better known as Northstar. He has a long history connected to the X-Men, starting with his first appearance, along with the rest of Alpha Flight, the Canadian superhero team, in Uncanny X-Men number 120, published in 1979, created by Chris Claremont and John Byrne. When Alpha Flight got its own series in 1983, writer/artist and co-creator of the character, John Byrne, wanted to make Jean-Paul into an explicitly gay character, but at the time was prevented by editor-in-chief Jim Shooter, and so could only occasionally hint at his sexuality. But there's much more to Northstar than his sexual preferences, so let's talk about more of his history and his powers. Jean-Paul and his sister Jean-Marie were orphaned due to a car accident that killed both their parents. The pair were separated, and Jean-Paul's adopted parents also died, leaving him twice orphaned. Despite these setbacks, Jean-Paul became a professional skier at a young age, even before his mutant powers of super speed and flight kicked in. When they did activate, he became basically unbeatable in the skiing world, and soon left the sport due to boredom. Later, realizing that the advantage those powers gave him, he relinquished all of his medals, being unable to determine the exact date his powers started. With his skiing career over, he briefly joined a Quebecois separatist movement, but was appalled by the violent methods they were using and left soon thereafter, joining the government-financed team Alpha Flight. It was here that he was reunited with his sister, who went by the codename Aurora, and had similar powers to her brother. In addition to their separate abilities, when the pair touched, they could generate blasts of light. Northstar was an on and off again member, but mostly on, of Alpha Flight throughout the 130-issue run on the title. He officially came out in issue 106, and sometime between then and joining the X-Men team in Uncanny X-Men number 414, wrote a book about his life as a mutant and gay man titled Born Normal. In addition to joining the field team, Northstar was also an instructor at the school, teaching his native French, economics, and classes in superpowered flight. One big event during Northstar's first stint with the X-Men was when Wolverine was killed and then resurrected by the Hand, a process which also brainwashes him into being their unwilling agent. While under their control, he attacked the X-Men, killing Northstar, who then underwent the same procedure. Once freed, Wolverine was able to knock out Northstar and sent him to S.H.I.E.L.D. to be deprogrammed. But their efforts failed, and he was soon captured by a new group, calling themselves the Children of the Vault. Still being quite susceptible to mind control, the group converted Northstar to their team, and he soon recruited his sister, who had her own mental issues going on at the time, to attack the X-Men. This time, he and his sister were helped by the X-Men themselves, and were able to recover. He was seen helping the X-Men during the Secret Invasion storyline, and soon thereafter officially rejoined the team, doing his best to balance his superhero life with his business life, as the CEO of a corporation making extreme sports equipment, in addition to his personal life, starting a relationship with the business's PR manager, Kyle Janadu, who would eventually become his husband, with their wedding shown in 2012's Astonishing X-Men number 51, the first gay marriage in the Big Two comics. Jean-Paul and Kyle relocated to Canada for a time, and Northstar rejoined Alpha Flight briefly, mostly to keep an eye on his sister, but this only lasted a short time, as Northstar was one of the many mutants who relocated to Krakoa when it became a mutant nation, with his husband Kyle being one of the few human residents. After his sister was murdered, this is during the time of the mutant resurrection protocols, so she quickly returned, Jean-Paul became involved with, then quickly was made the head of, the X-Factor team that was in charge of investigating mutant deaths to make sure that resurrection was the proper procedure, to avoid any clones, time displacement, or other tricks that would then cause more than one version of the same person to exist. Northstar was one of the survivors of the Hellfire Gala massacre, and in its wake returned to his native homeland of Canada, where he and other former teammates, from both Alpha Flight and X-Factor, worked to save local mutants who were being hunted by Orcus, the group responsible for the Hellfire Massacre, and Department H, the Canadian government agency that had started Alpha Flight. After that adventure, he was last seen in the X-Force safe house in the Arctic Circle. Though he's not part of any of the From the Ashes teams that I've seen so far, I'm sure the speedster is bound to show up sooner rather than later, once again breaking new barriers. That will wrap up this episode. Next time we broach this topic, we have a few reformed villains to talk about, as well as the younger sister of one of our previous entries in this feature. I also plan on doing a deep dive on Agatha All Along when it starts in a few weeks. But, in the meantime, if you have other topics you want me to cover, you can send those, or just general feedback on this show, via email at welcome2geektown@gmail.com. Or you can go to the website, welcome to, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com, and click the Submit a Question link if you prefer to remain anonymous. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcome-to-geektown, Twitter @geektownpodcast, Mastodon @welcome-to-geektown@mastodon.social, or Blue Sky @welcome-to-geektown.bluesky.social. Also, if you'd like to support the show directly, why not become a patron at patreon.com/welcome-to-geektown for just $1 per month to get access to full scripts of the shows, audio outtakes, and a monthly shoutout. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on Apple Podcasts to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show, so we can all tell them, welcome to Geektown, population, us. Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All of their sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.